Recording. Hi, everyone. Hope you're doing good. I am happy to be joined here today by Dr. Matt Alford. He's a lecturer at the Center for the Study of Violence at the University of Bath. He has published books including Real Power, Hollywood Cinema and American Supremacy in 2010, National Security Cinema, The Shocking New Evidence of Government Control in Hollywood, along with Tom Secker, which is a great resource book for a lot of you working on your projects now. And also Union Jackboot in 2018, What Your Media and Professors Don't Tell You About British Foreign Policy, which is a title I love. So thank you so much for joining us today, Matt.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks very much, Ben.
Yeah, wonderful. So I wanted to start with a short talk from you about, I believe you wanted to tell us a little bit about the media before we get started.
Yeah, I mean, I have a set piece that that I've delivered at a couple of different locations recently, and I thought that it would be a good summary of my latest take on media and politics. So let me set the scene. An evil dictator is on the brink of making a nuclear bomb at a secret facility carved deep into the Zagros Mountains. With no option, the American military deploys jets and, against all odds, destroys the factory, then flies home to the strains of Highway to the Danger Zone. An evil dictator is on the brink of using a nuclear bomb. With no option, the American military deploys secret agents and, against all odds, triggers a democratic revolution in that country by blowing up the dictator in his helicopter to the strains of Katy Perry's Firework. I've just outlined there the plots of Top Gun Maverick from last year, starring Tom Cruise, and The Interview from 2014, starring Seth Rogen and James Franco. But it also describes real-world aspirations here towards Iran and North Korea from top policymakers across NATO. And these parallels are no coincidence, because each film was actually subject to script changes imposed by Washington, D.C. In the documentary that we made, Theatres of War, last year, we show how the CIA and Department of Defense have exercised editorial control over thousands of films and TV shows in exchange for lending equipment like helicopters to producers to use on screen. Such films reflect and construct the paranoid fantasies of our imperial masters, most of them with direct script input. For example, kindly Marines unjustly slaughtered purely for handing out grain to hungry Africans in Black Hawk Down. Or the US politicians who are too innocent to realize that arming Islamic terrorists will lead to 9/11 in the Julia Roberts hit Charlie Wilson's War. Or the upcoming Gerard Butler film Kandahar, which I think actually came out last week, in which an evil dictator is on the brink of manufacturing a nuclear bomb at a secret facility carved deep inside a mountain, and with no option and against all odds. So is it any wonder that 30% of Americans in a poll said that they wanted to bomb Agrabah, the capital city in Disney's Aladdin? Is it any wonder that our politicians, as though clutching rosary beads, prefigure Russia's invasion of Ukraine with the word illegal, with no sense of irony, and unprovoked with little sense of history? When was the last thing that you actually saw which didn't depict Russia crawling with tyrants? Red Dawn, Rambo, Air Force One, Hunter Killer, almost any of the James Bonds, Jack Ryan, 24, Homeland, Stranger Things, the 6 o'clock news, whatever it is. I think that we urgently need a peace movement whose eyes are open to how actively the media, including Hollywood, simplifies wars to favor America's perspectives. The United States government has suppressed scripts, but on others, it has actually overturned their original meanings. In the Iron Man screenplay, for example, Robert Downey Jr.'s hero was opposed to his father's arms business in the original screenplay. But after rewrites, he became the ultimate evangelist for a bloodless industry. Peace means having a bigger stick than the other guy, he ends up saying. For 4 decades, almost all script changes had been concealed until our team used the law, the Freedom of Information Act, to acquire large bundles of government documentation. Regardless, the Defense Department's entertainment boss compared his role a few years ago in the court of Hollywood to that of a minor eunuch. This from a man who controlled hundreds of titles himself, including 12 of the top 20 grossing franchises of all time. That's more than Steven Spielberg. This guy's army of little Hitlers, again using inverted commas, have ensured that none of the scripts passing their desks depict war crimes, coups, assassinations, torture, or indeed anything that reminds the public of the nasty conspiracies in which America has engaged. Now, let me be clear. Hollywood producers and Hollywood celebrities are terrible on foreign policy issues, even without state interference. Consider Benedict Cumberbatch, who played the WikiLeaks founder, Julian Assange, in the 2013 film Fifth Estate. Assange tried reasoning with Cumberbatch in advance of the movie, saying that the studio will use him as a hired gun to assume the appearance of truth in order to assassinate it. But in response, Sherlock scoffed, as if I'm an easily bought cipher for right-wing propaganda, and adding, I've worked far less hard for more money on other projects. Cumberbatch demurred when asked to oppose the 35-year prison sentence for Assange's colleague, Chelsea Manning, pontificating, isn't it hypocritical to say we should know everything about you as a government, but you can't know anything about us? Curiously, while Fifth Estate presents Assange as a shifty egotist, it is Cumberbatch himself who claims there is only personal truth and wanted to play the Assange lead because I'm a vain actor. Acclaimed as a peerless journalist, Julian Assange, you may see just see a little protest banner up behind me here. Julian Assange has entered his 5th year in Britain's highest security prison. It's in central London. It's called Belmarsh, without trial, on a Byzantine set of espionage charges. Assange had used incontrovertible documentation to expose US massacres, sadistic detention procedures, corporate suppression of data on global warming, and the Democrats' own backroom machinations to destroy their socialist presidential candidate, Bernie Sanders, in favor of the less popular, by their own admission, hawk, Hillary Clinton. Those intimately involved in the Assange case say that the state has meted out torture, which includes giving him a computer to conduct his defense at one point with all of the keys superglued down, and also falsely diagnosing him at one point with HIV, supposedly a false positive. And where was Benedict Cumberbatch in any of this, in the middle of this? He was making The Courier in 2019, a production supported from the outset by the CIA and which mangled Cold War history to hype the threat from Moscow. Or consider the state affiliations of another nice celebrity, Sacha Baron Cohen. Cohen's production company claims that they lied to the US military in order to gain entry into a base in Alabama, but the scenes that are filmed there feel staged, setting up Cohen's character Bruno for a series of one-liners. Cohen apparently escaped from the military base by squeezing under a rapidly closing gate while guards yelled in pursuit, like a scene out of the A-Team. But do we really believe that version of events? Or do we think that Sacha Baron Cohen was in cahoots with the military for the filming of that comedy? Another time, Sacha Baron Cohen's Bruno interviewed a supposed terrorist who he discovered through a CIA contact. This terrorist turned out, in fact, to be a Palestinian greengrocer who said that Cohen had told him the interview was going to be about his peace activism. The resultant court case was settled for an undisclosed sum. In Israel, actually, Bruno was beaten by a crowd of Israelis. Bruno was you may probably know, many of you, Bruno was a very camp character. And in fact, for the purposes of the film, he is trying to, I think the plot of it is he's trying to become less heterosexual or something like that. And he dresses in very, very camp clothing. In Israel, Sacha Baron Cohen was filming as Bruno, but a gang of Israelis were angered by his camp clothing, and they started to stone him on camera. And for the first time ever, Sacha Baron Cohen broke character. He desperately yelled that he was an Israeli Jew, not a homosexual foreigner, and he fled for his life. The footage of this has never emerged, even though it would presumably highlight racism, supposedly what Sacha Baron Cohen is all about. Wrong racists. So call all of this propaganda, call it soft censorship, call it threat construction, whatever you want to call it. It shapes attitudes to foreign policy issues, and frankly, it's ridiculous, a lot of it. In 2003, the Americans said that Iraq had 5,000 tons of mustard gas, but after 13 years of sanctions, we got there and didn't even find mustard. This spring, America invoked the terror of China's spy balloon. Gee, I hope the Chinese don't send any more party paraphernalia our way. I'd hate for them to cover us in glitter. Of course, outside of these political fictions that are projected in the blue glow of our spooky little monitors, there is a real threat, and it's us. On Ukraine alone, leaks by people of conscience indicate casualties that might be approaching 500,000 in a deadlocked war, and yet we still insist that our objective is to weaken Russia and, it seems, allow the US to detonate our major oil pipelines across Europe, to tank our economies, and then bring the fight to Crimea. Even international specialist John Mearsheimer, propelled to fame by his opposition to the war, does so on the grounds that we should be allying with Moscow to threaten China, officially asserting that if not, Beijing will end up stationing missile systems in Mexico and Canada to target the United States. Ours is a demented political culture, egged on by hubristic visions of its own righteousness. We urgently need to be a purposeful peace movement with our eyes open to how the media holds diplomacy in abject contempt. That was my set piece beginning bit that I thought might be a good way of starting.
Yeah, I love that. I love that speech. I love the crackpot realism that's still around with us today of if we don't send battle cruisers through the Taiwan Strait, China's going to be putting nuclear missiles in Mexico 2 months from now.
I mean, obviously, John Mearsheimer is someone who, I buy his analysis a lot of the time, and I think he's a serious figure, and he's become very well known for his opposition to the Ukraine war and for blaming NATO primarily, saying that NATO had primary responsibility for it. I'm just saying that there is this, there's a problem with political and entertainment elites, which I think is more severe than just kind of tactical problems. I think that if John Mearsheimer is the most sort of anti-war, the leading anti-war figure, he basically wants a war with China. I mean, he doesn't want a hot war with China, but he wants a cold war with China. On the assumption that if we don't do that, China will end up causing a century of humiliation, national humiliation to the United States. It's paranoid nonsense. And if someone like John Mearsheimer, who's actually pretty rational, if he believes that, can you imagine how moronic and insane some of the ideas are going through the craniums of some of these lunatics who are ruling us? So I like John Mearsheimer. I think he should be part of an international conversation, absolutely. But he's obviously wrong on that. In fact, even the guy who was interviewing him for it, who was actually just I was going to say he was a university professor, but he wasn't. He was an author who said he was more independent. He was away from the institutions a little bit. He was just like, what the hell are you talking about? It's just not going to happen. There's going to be no situation ever where Mexico and Canada ally formally with China to box in the United States. It's such a ridiculous concept. It's unbelievable. No one would believe that. Sounds like a very poor game of Risk rather than any serious analysis. So anyway, sorry, rambling on a little bit. Am I meant to be rambling today? You asked me. Please ask me a question so I don't go off completely.
No, you're good.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for watching. And I understand that you've engaged with a lot of these ideas as part of this class, and it sounds great. I'm really encouraging of that, and pleased that you have.
Yeah, thank you. No, we got to watch the Theater's War documentary, look at some stuff from Trisha Jenkins and yourself and Tom Secker, and I think people have been really enjoying it. John. I just want to say John Mearsheimer. Yeah, it's funny that he has essentially the same take as like Tucker Carlson. That we shouldn't be fighting with Russia. We should be the real war is with China, which makes a dark bit of sense, I guess. But I also love the idea of China making the U.S. and the West go through a century of humiliation. Could you imagine the criminality of that?
Well, just the likelihood of China wanting or needing or being able to do that under any circumstances is just not there. But the fact is, even if for some bizarre reason China was able and had the will to somehow impose that, the chances of the United States sitting by and not nuking them 10 times over on the way that for them to be doing that at any point over the weeks and months and years that it would take to do it, it's just wholly implausible. So I think there is this, I mean, I don't know if you've discussed this before, but as you allude to, Tucker Carlson allying with John Mearsheimer in the same way that there are now sort of linkages even between someone like Henry Kissinger and Noam Chomsky. There is this peculiar thing where the peace movement, which I would say I'm part of, does sort of have peculiar allies, and sometimes they're on the right and sometimes they're on the left. I certainly think they're probably more often on the right than they used to be, and that's it's a peculiar place to be in. I did a debate a few years ago, just at the start of the Trump administration, and the I think he was like an American diplomat, and because I was sort of vaguely supporting Trump, sort of reluctantly supporting Trump, because I said, well, I think Hillary Clinton, in terms of foreign policy, could be really, really bad here. And he started to refer to the strange contortions of the left, because he considered me to be on the left, and that I was sort of making these bizarre, sort of snake-like, sort of peculiar turns. But I don't really see it as a left and right issue. I see it as issues to do with whether you prize and value diplomacy and also rational assessment of threats. And the fact is that, for the last 30 years, the United States and my country have not had any threats. And we should have been using that time to draw down the potential for great power rivalry, let alone great power war. And we didn't do that at all. It's been one of the reasons that I've stayed in politics myself, analyzing politics, because I could see that at the end of the 90s. And it horrified me. And what's been happening over the past 25 years it's been like a 25-year car crash, as far as I'm concerned, because it was always clear to me that terrorism was not going to be, the biggest deal, but that great power rivalry, if we didn't sort it out in the by the mid-late 90s, great power rivalry was going to happen again. And that's exactly what has happened. It's actually happened slightly slower than I expected. I thought that there were going to be a lot bigger problems a lot earlier, but I think that probably also speaks to the relative weakness and relative civility in foreign affairs of the other great powers. But that's not to say that China or Russia, or particularly at the moment Russia, are civil players in the grand chessboard. And that's one of the reasons what happened last year with Ukraine is so heartbreaking, because it's very hard to see a way back now for Russia. It has really crossed that Rubicon, or it has smashed the dam, however you want to put it. We're still not sure who's done that. But that on an emotional level, after following foreign affairs news for 25 odd years, it was I think pretty much exactly 25 years, and then to see the fruits of that result in a sort of resurgence, a completely unnecessary but completely predictable resurgence of Russian aggression on its border. It was heartbreaking, because there's not really a way back now. There's no good solution now. Whereas even 5 years ago, all of the great power rivalries could have been sorted out if the United States and Britain had the political will. Even with the political will now, it's not really going to be very doable. But I still think we should try, because I think we should still have a solution to these international crises, which is just going to be a worse solution than we could have had before. We should still have international treaties. We should still have arms control reduction agreements. We should still have international cooperation, and we're just going to have to have a crappy fudge deal over Ukraine for a start. And it's highly unfortunate, but it wasn't people like me or the anti-war movement who got us into this situation. It was the elites that are now crowing about how righteous they are, as they blithely wander into what Claire Daly, the Irish politician I saw yesterday, called the permanent abattoir of Ukraine, because that's their ideology. Just keep going, no plan, no exit, just keep on going like a berserker covered in blood. That's what they want to do.
Yeah,
but those are the same people who have been doing it for the last 25 years. And
right,
civilized people and vaguely sentient people have opposed that. Anyway, I'm rambling. It's because you keep nodding. So you.
No, you're right. Sorry, I do that. I
no.
like
You're
to
right.
interrupt people. I was
teasing.
Yeah, the newest war is always the just war. It's always going to be different this time, right?
Yeah.
So getting into some questions, I just wanted to ask, could you briefly go over, what do you think, like you and your colleagues who are working on this same sort of topic of the media and government influence on the media, what do you think are some of the important questions that you and maybe others are asking, and what do you think are some of the important contributions or maybe solutions that you're coming up with?
That's quite a difficult question for me to answer, because I would say that a lot of the major research on this has been done. A lot of the major questions have been asked. I mean, they were asked 40 years too late, because as you may know from following the film, for example, Lawrence Seward, the historian, who was the only historian pretty much who was working on this, or contributor of any kind, basically selfishly held on to all the documents, almost all the relevant documents himself, since the 1970s. So it's only really been in the 21st century that the questions have been asked, which is, how significant is the how extensive and how interventionist are these PR organizations in affecting Hollywood film scripts and TV shows, etc. Those questions are only really asked in this century, and sort of satisfactory documented answers only really came when myself and Tom Secker started to acquire the documentation circa 2000, I think it was January 2015, and then wrote National Security Cinema in 2017. So those questions, I'd say, are, how big and how impactful has the government been at various different levels of national security, at the various different aspects of the national security state in affecting Hollywood film scripts. I think we've got a pretty good idea now. So I think those are the main, and it's a lot. It's certainly by any measure 10 times larger than anything anyone knew in the early 20th century, but probably more than that, really. That's a fairly sort of conservative measure, I'd say. So in terms of what new questions are there to ask, I'm not sure. I mean, I feel like I've been promoting, maybe you've got ideas on that. I feel like I've been promoting the documentary over the last year, really, and probably will continue to do so for another year or so, because it's, I feel it's more about getting the message out than it is about research. I've not done I've not done what I would call research for several years, for various reasons, but one of them being, I think, in terms of this documentary, I think a lot of the answers have come to have been, a lot of the questions have been answered, and I think it's a matter of getting it out there to the public. I don't know, is there anything that you think that we've missed? I mean, Roger Stahl, the executive producer of the film, is leading up an academic book on this. I think it's probably a few years away, and I will support on that. But I think the main thing was, I think, uncovering this, what I would call really a conspiracy, because it was fairly well covered up. Not fully, but fairly well covered up by mainly through informal means, by the Department of Defense and these other organizations. And that's what me and Tom, I think, sort of contributed a lot to well, I think David Robb, the journalist, I think I sometimes say that he, in 2004, smashed a hole in the wall, if you like, if you want to put that as a metaphor. He smashed a hole in the wall, and then I think what me and Tom then did was open out that hole and sort of walk into the room. And now I think really what Roger's doing with Tom and me taking a bit more of a back seat is really exploring every nook and cranny of that room, if you want to put it in that kind of metaphorical term.
Okay.
Another long answer. This is going to go on forever.
Yeah, no, I don't feel like you gotta stretch out the questions
right.
if you don't have if you don't got a great answer. So yeah, that I get bring back Lawrence Seward real quick. I mean, the students have already seen that story a little bit, but one of them did ask about why didn't he let other people see his documents? Could you briefly recap the Lawrence Seward story and maybe answer like why he might not have been letting people see these important documents for so long?
Well, there has to be an element of speculation about this. As far as I'm aware, we don't know anyone who saw any of the documentation that he kept in his archive for many, many decades. We also know that both Tom and myself asked, and also even asked under fake names. I think we both made up like female names to say, you know, we're PhD students. Would you help us to whatever? So we had pseudonyms, and we went through various different means of trying to get him to respond for whatever reason. So we thought maybe he just didn't like us.
Mm-hmm.
But and we know that Trisha Jenkins asked him, and we know that Trisha Jenkins was offered some documentation on the Vietnam War films, but when she actually got to the library to do that research, she realized that the amount of documentation that she had been offered was so limited. I remember the frustration that she had at the time. Wow. It was so limited, it was so threadbare that she abandoned her project. I can't remember who else has asked, but I think one of my friends asked as well from New York, from Washington, DC, and then no response there either. So what he always said was, I can't give them to you at the moment. I'm working on them. Now, that might just be someone who's a bit, it's just their personality. They're a bit obsessive or whatever. But we do know through research, but primarily by Tom and Roger, that Lawrence Seward did have paid contracts with the Department of Defense at various points in his career. I think it was a couple of them, and I can't remember the extent of the work, but he worked extremely closely with them, and some of the time he was at least he was paid for that. So I think that there was a kind of I don't think it was ever that they were that I don't think it was necessarily them saying, we want to keep all of this material away from the public, make sure you do that. But I think perhaps it was a kind of understanding that that this was working out well for everybody. Is this just a personality glitch of Lawrence Seward, that he was a bit peculiar like that? Is it that he really was working on that material and he really did need it? I'm pretty cynical about that. I mean, I certainly think that in terms of would he need all documentation in an archive at all points? It just seems highly unlikely. He was extremely uncooperative. You could photocopy something if you need to, and it is indicative that the archive started just to open up a year before his death, and that's when I went to Washington DC to Georgetown University Library. And I found the less controversial documentation had then been set out there. And so I was able to find a few bits and pieces out. It was kind of worth the flight, maybe not. But it was still a good trip. But then a year later, when Lawrence Seward died, Roger Stahl also then went to Georgetown University, and he found the other half, basically the much juicier and the much more annotated and the scripts and many more memos and a lot more details and a lot of the more sexy films, the James Bond films and I think the Hulk films and the Marvels and all of that. And so he was able to find a lot more then. I think there must have been something that the relationship between the library and Lawrence Seward, without sort of besmirching the library, I just think it's fair to say that relationship was significant in terms of what was able to come out. And I think perhaps the library was complicit there in not being terribly open with that documentation.
Yeah. I mean, this is also getting into speculation, but do you think that says that whole Lawrence Seward and the library story says anything about maybe academia more broadly? Is academia, I mean, you've been in that. Is academia part of the problem here as well, in terms of their pliability to power?
Uh, the short answer to that is I think definitely yes. In fact, you mentioned at the top of this show about the book that I did with TJ Coles, Union Jackboot, what your professors won't tell you about foreign policy. I actually, I always slightly think we shouldn't have said professors. I think that was TJ Coles. I thought we should say teachers, because I thought we were talking more about, kind of the whole schooling system. But actually, I find myself slightly less uncomfortable with that title because, yeah, universities are part of the problem. Actually, I mean, I think we published that book about 5 years ago, and actually, yeah, I mean, I did feel that when I went to Georgetown University, that they were part of something that wasn't terribly healthy for the dissemination of knowledge. And I mean, you know that there are quite a few decent books out there about this, like The Coddling of the American Mind and various others that are that indicate that university systems are not very good. But I mean, and I can't remember that literature particularly well myself. I'm more coming from the Noam Chomsky perspective, and when Chomsky talks about the de-radicalization, the declawing of discourse, I mean, everyone associates him with the media, and everyone thinks that he's talking about the New York Times and the Washington Post and all that. But Chomsky has been always much wider than that. He's been referring to the responsibility of intellectuals. That was his first major published article in 1967, the responsibility of intellectuals. And he says that they're not being responsible at all. And so I think that there is an overall problem within academia and across society, and particularly amongst elite society, where they are serving the interests of powerful political and corporate entities, and are not comfortable or interested in things like the peace movement, but also other things that are usually connected with the left. So I do think that there is a broader problem there, and I think that this does point to that. In fact, and again, sorry to continue with my ramble, but for the way of characterizing the film, I was encouraging more of that for the documentary, because I think perhaps because Roger's a very successful academic. However, the people who, the other people around him, and the other people who have pioneered this story over the past 15, 20 years have been oddballs. They haven't been academics. They haven't been the professors of whatever. There's been me, a part-time teacher, and whatever else I do. There's been Tom Secker, who I don't even know what job he does, but I think for a while he worked maybe part-time for a local charity or something. He hasn't done any academic work. There was David Robb, who did that first relatively sort of short book where he kind of opened up that field, who was a kind of renegade freelance journalist who I met in LA a few years ago. And he just was sort of like, he was kind of chain smoking with his trousers half done up. And, so all the people who have tended to characterize this field have been, we've been on the fringes. We've not been a sort of mainstream academia, I wouldn't say at all. So I think there was perhaps differences between my perspective on that and say what Roger Stahl was his perspective. But he sort of thought, well, we're kind of all doing stuff, and we're all academics, and we're all kind of academia is working here. It's making truth come to light. We're analyzing stuff over time. And I was like, this isn't a story of academic success. This is a story of massive structural academic failure over 4 decades, at least. But maybe that wasn't a very popular way of putting it.
Well, yeah, it's easy for Roger to say, I guess. Yeah, I mean, me being in academia, I have come to the sense that the university system has always been deeply intertwined with the national security state for the past, since the Cold War, and even if a lot of academics like to play the radical, perform radicalism, it's what they're doing usually isn't that dangerous to power. So yeah, one more question I had about the Seward story is, like, do you think since David, Rob, and your work, has the Department of Defense or CIA, have they gotten more defensive with their information compared to when they were mostly just working with Lawrence Seward, and they had a friendly person who they could give information to? Are they now more protective of their information now that there's some actual people sniffing around that aren't so friendly?
Well, Seward died in 2018, I think, the end of 2018, or maybe 2019. I think it might be a little bit early to tell, and also I'm also not quite sure. Roger and I are due to go to an archive next summer, and so that will be an interesting test of how things are going. I do know that for a while there was talk of all of the material from Georgetown University being sent back to the Department of Defense, and that was around about 2019, 2020. But I haven't heard anything about that since, and I wonder if that might be to do with the coronavirus getting in the way, or if it's just been delayed in general. Maybe they've changed their minds. I'm not sure. So I think things are in flux a little bit with how that's all with what's all happening there. I think as well, in terms of the cover-up, I think it's not a cover-up in the sense that it's not kind of a blanket ban. I mean, the Pentagon has always been happy for Hollywood producers to know that it has a PR office. That's not a secret. In fact, they advertise that to the extent that, they say, come and get our aircraft carriers and all that kind of thing. So the cover-up really is in the extent to which they're uncomfortable with the amount of products that have been interfered with. And in fact, Phil Strubb, the head of the office, as I alluded to earlier, the guy who says that he's a minor eunuch, he is I think he was asked, how many films or whatever have you done, and he was just like, oh, I don't know, which is just kind of because if you'd given the figure, it would have blown the interviewer away, because it would have been extremely disturbing. And they're also very worried about the extent to which there is interference on these products. But they don't deny that something is actually happening, that they are doing things in Hollywood. So it's a kind of a soft cover-up, you could perhaps call it, or it's a cover-up in certain areas of the scandal. So I think that there probably are changes in terms of the way that they're trying to manage that information. But I think it's perhaps too early to tell exactly how they're doing that. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that that they've always managed the information, but allowed some of the information to come out anyway. So I'm not quite sure how radical those changes will be anyway. A lot of things are now computerized as well, as since the Seward time, because most of his documentation went up to about 2004. And so a lot of the documentation that he was using was on paper, and that's all changed now. And now there's this DARPA database, which is electronic. And so, and also they might not care that much, because I think that's the other thing as well. You've got to remember, just because, me and Tom and Roger and whoever put some stuff out there, it's not going to check. We're not going to turn around the Titanic with that. So they might not care that much. I mean, I suspect they're a bit pissed off about it, but it's not going to be enough to interfere with their operations. So I think they'll probably continue to allow some material to go out. But Tom has had various frustrations with the FOIA for years, and I think including recently, where they've not provided information. And from the end of the documentary that we were sent several thousand pages of blank paper because they said, oh yeah, all of this material is redacted. So they literally hard copy posted to Tom. I think it was hundreds. I think it was thousands. I can't remember now. It was whatever it said in the documentary. All just completely blank paper. It must have been great for his printer because it meant that he could use blank paper in a printer. Who gets free paper through the post? Great.
Yeah, ink budget's never been better.
They should have sent a couple of ink cartridges as well. Subscriptions to Ryman's, whatever it's called. Office World.
It just seems like it must have been nice for them for a while, that for decades all they had to deal with was Lawrence Seward. Now they got
I guess that is right. That they must have found that relationship straightforward, and there was no one really criticizing that. But at the same time, I think they've really expanded operations very, very significantly in the 21st century, particularly because they've gone into TV. So I don't think. Maybe I'm sort of splitting hairs a little bit, but I don't know if the PR people at the Pentagon are sort of like, oh god damn it, we've got reporters on our tail now. We were really worried about that. I think probably what they thought is we are massively expanding our operations. What's going to happen about that? Oh, it's very likely that we're going to get more publicity and probably more flack for it, and that's fine. We'll just manage that information. So I'd love to be the kind of crusading Woodward and Bernstein type character in this, but I think that in the end they've still got the upper hand here very much, and that as long as they continue to do their operations, I don't think they're going to let it piss on their parade too hard.
Yeah. Okay. I actually wanted to ask about that. When did they get into TV more fervently or more intensely than they had in the past?
I think it was around about 2004. I think there's a document somewhere which talks about the decision to get into satellite television, and for some reason they'd always resisted doing that before. I think they had always done that a little bit. Like, for instance, even in the 1950s and 60s, they'd worked on things like Lassie, the dog show Lassie, and they'd worked on a few UFO TV shows and stuff like that. But it was around about 2004 that they sort of really got into the networks and started expanding a lot into all those cookery shows and quiz shows and Ellen DeGeneres' show and all that kind of thing. It happened around about then, and so that's partly what accounts for this great rise in the number of productions that they have become involved in. But it also that also sort of coincided as well with the kind of uber dominance of Marvel as well. And of course, the DoD has worked on almost all of the Marvel productions as well. So in several different ways, several different dimensions, if you like, the national security state grew as a force within the entertainment industry from the very early 21st century. And of course, that includes the CIA as well, because it wasn't until, I keep forgetting the date, I think it's 1996 that they formed their entertainment liaison. So all of these things have really been over the past quarter century. That's not to say that there wasn't a lot going on before that. It was still a pretty big operation that was going on during Seward's time. And he certainly still dropped the ball in terms of the number of productions that were being affected. and even more so in terms of the level of interference that was being enacted on these products, and indeed, of course, the number of scripts that were being simply discarded out of hand because they didn't match with the Department of Defense's interests. But there has been an escalation in multi-dimensional escalation over the past quarter century in this whole phenomenon, which makes it all the more significant and important.
Right. Yeah. I got to talk with Trisha Jenkins last week about this a bit.
Oh,
And
nice.
one thing I asked was, how she frames the CIA getting into the media and getting into this entertainment liaison and in like engaging the media in a more official capacity. She frames it as a defensive reaction to like, oh, well, they were facing these scandals and people were talking about, cutting the CIA's budget, maybe even abolishing the CIA now that the Cold War is over. But I was just like trying to get the timeline of these things. It's like under CIA Director James Woolsey, where they try to do that classified files of the CIA show, and he really gets into that, but then he leaves and the show falls apart. And then it's either like right before or right when George Tenet becomes the CIA director that they hire Chase Brandon and start this liaison office. And Woolsey was a big hawk. He was a Project for a New American Century member, and Tenet famously was in charge of cooking up a lot of the intelligence for the Iraq War. Famously said it's a slam dunk case about weapons of mass destruction. And I just get the sense of like, maybe it was less defensive because I mean, me being a younger person, just the idea of this country, the USA, getting rid of any of its 17 intelligence services seems laughable. I guess before 9/11, it seemed more realistic, but it seems more like, I wonder how much this could have been like part of an offensive approach of like basically the CIA and the entire national security state preparing for a major geopolitical and ideological offensive, which they enter into in the 21st century with the war on terror and all these interventions. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but
yeah,
that's kind of speculation.
I basically agree with you. I think it's very I think to say that any major kind of unassailable security organization like the CIA is kind of operating only reactively. Oh, well, what can we do? I think is a very kind of I can't think of a better word. A nice way to put it. I don't really think that is the case. I would say, if you think about the threats to the CIA in the 1990s, there were the beginnings of some moves by a senator or two to say, do we need the CIA? Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, they may have felt defensive. They may have felt under attack. And it may have been, and it should have been, the beginning of massive structural security service reforms in the United States. But it wasn't. It was no way. Whether that means that the CIA was, has operated more within the entertainment industry because it wanted to prepare for a kind of 9/11 or the re-emergence of great power rivalries. I'm not sure if that's quite true either. I suspect it was just that they had the will, they had the prompt from being criticized. They knew that the Cold War was over and that they knew that they therefore needed to rely more for their own legitimacy on lies, basically, or on information management. So I suspect that it was more that. But at the same time, you look at a film like Wag the Dog, the Dustin Hoffman film, and actually they allude to exactly what you've just been talking about, where the De Niro character, the CIA character, says, that this fake war that we're making in the media, that we're just cooking up, see it as a rehearsal. And talking to his colleagues in the national security services, who are like, you can't just make up a war and put it on in a movie. And he says, well, you know, what's going to happen? You know, like in a few years' time, we're going to have all this. There's going to be some kind of horrible terrorist attack, and we're going to have to be ready for it then. So we may as well make the war a fictitious war on television now, get the budgets all sorted out, and then we can, that's all going to be good for us in future. So I think there probably was a bit of a strain of that kind of thinking. Just to clarify, I'm not sure if you saw Wag the Dog, it's a sort of famous film from 1997. In which they are cooking up a fake war. But so I think there probably was some of that mentality going on as well. But I suspect that, I think Trish's answer is probably the kind of formal, most easily documentable answer. But I also think it's a little bit rich for the CIA to say that to characterize themselves as being under threat of closure of some kind. I don't think that could have happened without a hell of a lot more political will. And I certainly think that they were willing and able to weaponize information and to expand that role for their own PR ends and also for their own disinformation ends.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it seems like that was the CIA's reason for why they did that, and you know, there could be some truth to that, and there usually is, but should also be skeptical.
One thing I'd say, maybe this doesn't make a great video, but I would just point out that of all the bits that that we've done, I think it is here actually, of all the bits that we've done in terms of writing, probably the section that I'm particularly happy with, that me and Tom worked on really, really well together, is the bit about the history of the CIA in this book, National Security Cinema. I can't remember exactly where it is. It's around about page 28. And the reason that's good, sorry, page 23 for about sort of 20 pages from page 23. The reason that I'm really pleased with that is because we were interrogating what little historiography there was out there, which was very conservative and presented the CIA as a very defensive and reactive organization that hadn't really done very much in this in Hollywood. And what me and Tom did, I'm really pleased with, is we picked through the evidence and found a lot of new documentation to show how from the mid 1940s and then all the way up through to near enough the present, the CIA's role was much more significant than had been presented in any of the including the contemporaneous scholarly work on it on this. So yeah, I can't remember that 20-page section off the top of my head, but I remember at the time that we did it in 2017, I was like, we've really nailed that, and that's a kind of significant one of the most significant parts of that book, because it reflects what was also happening in the Department of Defense. The fact that it didn't seem like a great deal was happening in the DoD, but actually there was a huge amount. And actually that the same thing was paralleled with the Central Intelligence Agency. It was just it was on a smaller scale to what the Pentagon was doing, but still comparatively, as compared to what the historians had pointed out, the CIA was also doing 10 times more than anyone knew, in the same way that the DoD was doing 10 times more. Mm-hmm. In the same way that David Robb in 2008 wrote an article that indicated that the FBI, albeit back in the 70s, was doing a lot more. I can't remember, I don't know if 10 times more would be quite accurate, but a very, very considerable amount more than anyone had realized. The FBI worked on several hundred productions under Hoover.
Yeah, the FBI is very interesting. I think Walt Disney, famously a FBI informant, and did propaganda for the FBI. I did read that section in National Security Cinema on the CIA during the Cold War. I actually have someone who's writing about Animal Farm, George Orwell's Animal Farm. So you that'll probably be a useful section for you. The part about Oliver North scuttling a movie that was supposed to be made about the Iran-Contra affair is pretty
Yeah,
incredible story.
incredible, isn't it? Outbidding Marlon Brando, who wanted to buy the script for a production about the Iran Contra kind of drug running slush fund scandal from the 80s, and they just bought the script and buried it. So I mean, there's only fairly limited information out there about that, but it's been verified. So that kind of thing that was going on is it's amazing, really, or at least it was amazing at the time. Since 2017-18, I've been a bit like that's not much of a surprise anymore.
Yeah.
Because but that information that we uncovered around about that period 5+ years ago, it's a huge story. I mean, that's one of the reasons it's run and run in terms of the book sales of a self-published book. The book sales we still get a bit of cash for that because people are still buying it. I still get offers of interviews all the time for national security. So it was only turned into a documentary last year. I think people recognize the inherent newness and nightmarishness of what the national security state has done and is continuing to do in the entertainment industry, which I'm glad for, I suppose.
Yeah.
Nice to fix it.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of regular working people enjoy this kind of really find this stuff interesting. My grandfather certainly loved Vietnam War veteran, always loves talking about JFK and the mafia and the CIA. He loved that documentary. Theaters of War.
Yeah. That was you mean the Oliver Stone, the movie?
No, the Theaters of War documentary.
Oh, Theaters of War. Oh, our one. Yeah. You're good. I'm
really
pleased.
Appreciate Oliver Stone.
Thanks to you. I'm glad to hear from your granddad about that. That's nice. Yeah, I can't remember. I was going to add something then, but that's great. Thank you.
Okay, I got sticking on the topic of the CIA. I wanted to ask real quick. Maybe this came up in some of your research, or you got to glean this a bit. So we've gotten to read about CIA's influences in Hollywood and kind of their nuances of their approach versus the DoD's approach. Thinking like ideologically though, does the CIA have an ideological perspective that is different from the DoD in how they like want their movies to be to tell a story? Have you noticed any of that, or does it seem to be very similar to the DoD?
I think I'll answer fairly briefly there because I think there are differences. But I think to lay those differences out properly would probably require an academic paper or an article. Maybe someone wants to do it. I think probably there is something to be. At the end of the day, they're both organizations, political organizations, which are potentially extremely controversial and which should be heavily reformed or got rid of. So their primary purpose is to stay alive, is to continue to exist. So from that point of view, they're basically trying to show we are the good guys. In fact, when Chase Brandon got involved with the CIA PR office, he said at the beginning, we're sick of being told we're the bad guys, because in the 1970s and 80s, the CIA was presented as the villains very commonly in popular culture. And it's the same thing with the Department of Defense. They want to be able to say, we're the good guys. We come in and we secure everything. We make everything safe. So primarily, ideologically, that's what they're doing. They are also, kind of nationalistic in the sense that they believe in American power. They believe in the benevolence of American rule, Pax Americana. Are there differences, though? Yeah, there probably are some differences in terms of the kind of approach there. And I think to really tease out those differences, I think I'd probably need to write them down for my own head. I guess one of them is that the CIA certainly has, at least at times, has used entertainment as a kind of way to freak out and intimidate opponents. So there were a couple of products, Enemy of the State, for example, in 1998 with Will Smith, and also the TV series The Agency, where they were using technology in those productions, and they were indicating that the CIA had this very advanced technology, and there appears to be it appears that technology was not really available at the time, or even if it was, the CIA through Chase Brandon said, you know, even if it's not, even if we can't actually do that, we don't care. Terrorists watch TV too. Let's intimidate them. Mm-hmm. So I think perhaps the spooks have got some kind of little their own little in jokes and their own little little agendas and games that they like to play in influencing productions. And bear in mind, you know, that they're doing this they tend to be doing this from very early in the productions, because that's the only way that they can influence a film like Argo or whatever, because the CIA can't give very much equipment and stuff. So they tend to make these relationships very early on in the production process, even more so than the Department of Defense. And so that allows them to put in all sorts of things that probably will never know exactly what those things are. So, for instance, given as an example, we don't exactly know, but of course, the character of Jack Bauer from 24 and the whole way that came about. I mean, that's going to be Chase Brandon. That's going to be heavily influenced by him through chatting with those actors and producers at an early stage, just in the same way that the character from Meet the Parents, the De Niro character from Meet the Parents and Meet the Fockers and all that, will have been, you know, based on and heavily influenced by Chase. And so there's going to be all sorts of aspects of that won't ever have been written down. And indeed, the documentation that we have from the CIA has always been relatively poor. The DoD actually, even though it hides a lot of its documentation through one means or another, usually sort of informal means, the Department of Defense at least writes all of its stuff down. Try getting material about this, you know, even about sort of interference in movies. And the CIA is pretty hard to crack with that. You may remember, I think, from the film, from the documentary, or certainly from the book. It must have been from the documentary, because I had an envelope come through my door during lockdown. I think it was mid 2020, and it was. I thought, why on earth is there a CIA stamp on this, or a Washington DC stamp on this? And why am I suddenly reading a bunch of emails from Ben Affleck to the CIA? And I realized that I'd put in a Freedom of Information request back in 2012. So they'd taken 8 years to send me this information. Anyway, that's slightly off the point that you're saying about ideology, but I'm just saying that there's an element of, perhaps even less accountability from the CIA. So they are liable to be a bit more sneaky, a bit more spooky, a bit more gameplay than the Department of Defense, which is a larger and more kind of slightly more straightforward organization. But in the end of the day, they're both after their, looking after their own interests in terms of showing that they are part of this, the necessary securitization of the US.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I just because Trisha Jenkins mentioned that the CIA has been allowing for more nuance, I think she calls it, in their movies. Allowing for some discussion of some of the more some controversial aspects of their.
Well, there is that. There's perhaps a less of a desire and or less of a will, less of an ability to control. So certainly myself and Tom have speculated about this, and Tom has written about it, about some of the films in the 70s, for example, even say something like Last Day of the Condor, the Robert Redford movie, where the CIA is presented as assassins. But the CIA director appeared on set for, I think it was a day or two, and was the CIA giving the sort of tacit blessing to that film, or having some kind of impact on that film? And and was the CIA actually quite comfortable with being presented as assassins? Because at the end of the film, they say, you know, where would you be without us? You'd be without oil. The lights are going to go out. We're the ones that go around killing people to get stuff done. So that's one of the things I'm talking about in terms of like the CIA might be more willing to be more creative, more playing more games in those scripts, where the DoD is more likely to follow it by the book a little bit more. But there are various examples along those lines, which you'll be able to see if you go to spyculture.com's Tom's site, or indeed, I think there's examples of that in National Security Cinema as well. I think perhaps to give a more full and frankly better answer, I'd have to sort of have it written down a little bit more and think it through a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I would reiterate the spyculture.com as a resource for students. It's a great resource. Yeah, and the DoD just seems to be so obsessed with smoothing out all the possible edges that there can possibly be. The CIA can, you know, they have their own term for kind of what they call a limited hangout, right? Of like, to dangle out a little bit of the controversy, and so that people will be satisfied with that and not look any further. That's I couldn't help but think of that when I saw last week we watched Argo in this class, and you know, the beginning of that, they actually do very briefly touch on the coup against Mossadegh. But then there's a lot more controversial stuff going on at that time too, there's some good evidence that, you know, the Ronald Reagan campaign and some elements of the CIA at least were making sure that the hostages didn't get released before Reagan got elected.
The October surprise. Yeah.
October counter surprise. And next week we'll be learning a bit about the cultural Cold War, and one of the most fascinating things about that is the CIA's support for what they call the non-communist left during that time, the fact that so many CIA officers graduate from like elite universities, it seems like, I don't know, maybe the CIA, at least when not with the peasants that they string up, but with the you know, Hollywood people that they work with and domestic people they work with, maybe they know the liberal mind a bit better, and can appeal to liberal Hollywood a bit better on their own terms.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of going back historically. It's sort of, you know, trying to appeal. It's when the authorities try and appeal to people like your George Orwells, you know, who are kind of on the left, but, you know, kind of appealing to their sort of rational side, and that can be very dangerous, because you end up having perfectly reasonable people and intellectuals and whole artistic movements and all that kind of thing, and magazine editors and all deciding that actually, yeah, it's better to side with the CIA, and it's just those kind of compromises that people sometimes make, understandably. It goes back to I've been rereading Graham Greene's The Quiet American recently, which is a fantastic book about those kind of compromises that people make when they're faced with power. In this case, set in Vietnam in the mid-1950s, and in fact written amazingly in the mid-1950s, before Vietnam was Vietnam. I'm just thinking, Ben, just because it's quite hot here, and I know that I've got some people turning up at my door shortly, and I don't want to continually interrupt the filming. Should we just have one or two more questions and then wind down? I also think I'm going to end up sort of flagging and also being interrupted.
Yeah, sure thing. Okay. Well, I had a big question that I should ask, because I kind of explained this to you. One of the kind of major question I have around for the class in general is, like, do these relationships between the media and the national security state or the government represent an erosion of democracy or a threat to democracy? What would you say to that? What are your thoughts on the media and, you know, democracy or our democracy itself?
Yeah, I mean, that is a huge question, and it's one to, I mean, I think the short answer is that it is really important. This relationship between the national security state and Hollywood is really, really important. That said, if you are writing about this, if you're writing a book about this or an article or essay, whatever it is, I would say it's still important to put into context, what's going on. At the end of the day, American democracy has been crumbling, or is a shadow of what it's meant to be for many, many other reasons than what's happening in Hollywood of all places. I think this is just one example of where there is national security state involvement. It happens to be a pretty big one, though, I'd say. I mean, when Carl Bernstein from Watergate fame wrote about in 1977 about the number of intelligence assets who were operating in on the major newspapers at the New York Times and elsewhere. I mean, that was a major article, a sort of 10,000 word article.
That would be really good too, actually.
Yeah, but I mean, and a lot of this was just through luck, really, and just sort of hanging around and asking a couple of questions at the right time. But I kind of think what we've done there as a group is we've found something of comparable size. So I do think it is very significant, but exactly how to put that into words to evaluate the severity of that within the overall American political culture, I'm not quite sure exactly what words I'd use for that, because there's so much more that is nightmarish about the American system. And I'm particularly, I can't really comment on I can't really comment with any great authority about the entirety of the United States. So I think that kind of question is I think people should interpret that themselves, but be aware that there is at least something significant and pretty bad happening on this issue. But how bad you consider that to be and how significant you consider that to be is more of an open question.
Okay. Yeah, I understand that. To speak on some, you might be more able to speak on where you're at. I mentioned one of my students is writing on George Orwell's Animal Farm. Do you think that can you give us any insights into the UK government's relationship with the media? Is it substantially different or similar to the US's approach?
Well, I've got a couple of things that I can say about that. Again, I don't know how perfect they'll be for a video. They might be useful for your class at least. One, I'd say we know that there is some involvement from the British state, and we've started to document that. We are also pretty certain that it won't be anything like as significant as what the United States does by any measure. I'm currently working with a PhD student who you might want to be in contact with at some point, and his whole project is looking at the British case, effectively national security cinema, but in Britain. And the results of that will be really, really interesting, but I don't think they'll be out for 5 years. Okay. But we do know that there are organizations that operate in Britain with the kind of tacit support of the British government, that are sort of like agencies that are ex-military and all that kind of thing. And they've worked on huge productions like Kingsmen, for example, the Colin Firth movie, which is kind of all kind of military recruitment, kind of glorifying kind of the British military involvement in World War One. Interestingly, they even in one of those, they demonize Rasputin, for example, in Russia, as a sort of this evil figure who is trying to get the Russians out of World War One. So he's this evil baddie who's trying to end Russian involvement in the war.
The maximum involvement.
Yeah. This is how militarized the mindset is, across our civilization. Maybe it's a human problem just generally, but anyway. So there are these productions that are worked on by British organizations, and also sometimes on various things like TV soaps and stuff like that as well. But obviously with less political implications, and also films like 1917 and all that, all those kind of things have that kind of support. We don't know either the level of script interference with those, and it might be that there's a lot more informality with that. There are a few cases of documentaries that have been pulled off air from the BBC and stuff like that as well. And of course, these days the whole shadow banning of people and ideas and all that. There's all sorts of different forms of control now. So that's all happening, and it's all significant. I think that we'll have much clearer results on that in about 4 or 5 years' time. But it's interesting. But I still think that the United States is the major game in town.
Okay. Thank you. Should we end it there?
I'm happy to do one more question, but I'm just I can see my face on the camera just sort of slightly going, like, getting tired. So at some point I should probably call an end to this. And also I think we'll get interference at any moment, although the food order seems to be delayed.
Okay.
Is there anything else? Is there any sort of burning question that you think I might be able to answer well?
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe. I have one more quick question. I mean, in the Theaters of War documentary, you talk about some of the gendered aspects and covering up sexual assault and the tailhook scandal and things like that. A lot of DoD support to the media seems to be is about boosting recruitment, right? And women have become a growing and increasingly more important part of new recruits in the military. How has the rise of women's involvement in the military changed these recruiting patterns and maybe the DoD's approach to Hollywood and gender in the movies they work on?
That's another very good question, and another one that I'm not sure I can answer brilliantly. I certainly know that Tom Secker on Spy Culture has written specifically about the issue of assault in the military, and has contextualized that as well. I mean, I think it's what to say. I mean, I think it sounds like very well the very high levels of all sorts of different assault in the military. It's a very bad and unfortunate and deceptive thing to suggest that the military is some kind of sort of gorgeous fraternity and an equivalent where everyone's looked after, because from what I can see, that is just very much not the case on the whole. And a lot of people come out with really with great harm having been done to them. But that's not to say everyone. I mean, sorry to equivocate, but there are military people who follow our work who they've been all right in the military. And actually they might well oppose more what they've done overseas, or what their government has had to do what their government has made them do overseas. I suppose the one insight that I would have with it is that, thinking about the CIA was very, very, very low on female recruits in the 90s, and that's one of the reasons that they got involved. Was not just to shape political narratives, but also to recruit women, and I think to some extent minorities as well, but I think primarily women. And so when they came out with that Jennifer Garner TV series called Alias in 2001, she did an unpaid advertisement for the CIA when that happened. And she was also married to Ben Affleck, and Ben Affleck was about to film Sum of All Fears, which was another CIA-supported production, which also had Department of Defense support and came out just before 9/11. and so there was this drive to get women to join the CIA, to see that as a very glamorous thing. And Jennifer Garner was the star of that. She was the driver of that. Now, 2001, that year was, in terms of TV shows, was most associated with Jack Bauer and 24. But actually, Jennifer Garner in Alias was also a pretty big deal at that particular time. And of course, Homeland doing something similar with a neurodivergent person and woman as the main hero, Claire Danes' character. So, and that was that was another set of documents that came to my house a few years ago, was the material on Homeland. Because previously we didn't know that the CIA had supported it, but actually they did. I mean, it always seemed very likely, but there'd been no sort of news report on anything like that. So there are various shows from the CIA's catalogue which have promoted female recruitment and neurodivergent recruitment, and I think to some extent minority recruitment. So that's the more obvious one to me, but it has also happened with the Department of Defense recruiting for the military as well. And I guess for me, in terms of sort of a moral or ethical thing, I'd have thought that, the risks to women from joining the CIA are probably not much greater than men joining the CIA. So from that perspective, it's less controversial. But women being invited to join the Department of Defense, there's another layer of threat that or danger that they are opened up to if they do that. And so I guess that's a bit more. There's an added layer of sort of grossness about that to me. But
yeah, one of my students mentioned being a military brat growing up, and she wanted to join the military, but was turned off to it by all the stories about assaults and people not being held accountable for things like that. It's very to see it go from Top Gun to Captain Marvel, where equating the military as some kind of feminist institution.
Yeah, I mean there is all that as well. The sort of the masculinized nature, or even though it's kind of homoerotic, of Top Gun in the 80s. And the sort of the greater emphasis on intelligence, less emphasis on brawn over brains, that's been happening over the past quarter century or so. And I guess that is to do with sort of trying to the military trying to appeal, the national security state trying to appeal beyond just kind of sort of rugged, sort of cliche masculine men. But yeah, I think maybe I should say one thing as well, is that I definitely don't want. I do try and put in this as a point to make. My quarrel is not with the military service personnel. I mean, this is an issue primarily of a very powerful, a superpower's national security apparatus being reckless and dangerous. And yeah, recruitment it's not great, I don't think, what they're doing there, but that's not my primary problem. I really see this as a problem this is a global problem, that we've got one of the most dangerous, violent entities on earth, smashed in the middle of Washington DC and again nearby in Virginia, who are terrorizing in many ways the various different places on the planet with explosive consequences. And the fact is that we're feeding that with by being audiences at their shows and films, and indeed their football matches and fundraisers and everything. Political culture and popular culture are meshing together there in a very unfortunate way. So that's my primary concern. I certainly agree with organizations like Veterans for Peace, for example, which I think operates both in the United States and in Britain, Yeah, I'm behind those people, and I very much welcome them as part of. We do very much welcome them as part of this conversation and this effort to resist sort of irrational and escalatory moves in foreign affairs.
Yeah, right. So one of the reasons they don't let Thomas Young speak, you hear his speeches in the Long Road Home miniseries, is because veterans, some of their speeches can actually be quite powerful when they speak out against the war. And yeah, I did really appreciate that you ended that they ended the documentary with the the violence that and the imperialism that is associated with the military. In Laos, we made that the most bombed country in the world, and people can't even point it out on a map. People still get limbs blown off, and people don't know jack about it.
Yeah, well, at the moment we've got because of this flooded dam from a couple of days ago,
right.
In Ukraine, you've literally got minefields that have been destroyed, and therefore there are now floating mines just floating around in the water that people are going to bump into and blow up on. And I think for me, like, whoever did that atrocity, and it could have been the Russians, or it could have been the Ukrainians. My guess would be the Ukraine, but I'm not getting into that. The point is, any side could have done that because you're in the middle of a massive war, and there's always going to be atrocities on both sides. What's the solution to that? We have to have negotiation and a peace movement to sort that out. Whoever is to blame, it's always easy to focus on the who is the problem. The problem is obvious. Everyone's the problem there. It's a nightmare because all sides are going to have legitimate grievances and legitimate anger, and of course those problems are only going to escalate. We can't allow that to go on for. I don't think we should allow it to go on for a day longer. But they're talking about allowing it to go on for years more. How bad is that actually going to get? There's the will and the ability for both sides in that war to destroy everything very easily. They could destroy that country themselves. The Ukrainians could destroy the country themselves in a matter of weeks. It just depends whether all sides in that conflict want to turn it into something that's going to have 7-figure casualties or 8-figure casualties.
Right. Yeah. The military-industrial complex loves its small wars, but it's not always they're not always going to stay small. Okay. We can end it there. You and I can say our goodbyes after we stop recording, but
yep.
I hope my students enjoyed it, and feel free to let me know if you have any questions after watching this. I'd love to help you.
That would be great, and feel free to add me on Facebook / the writer with no hands. The writer with no hands. That's the main place I put stuff out. It'd be great to connect with some of you, and I hope you really continue to enjoy the study.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, I appreciate how reachable you are. All right. Bye, everyone. Have a good day.